the good funds attract the good startups, and then the good startups refer other good startups, and eventually they go to the same fund. And it's like it's feeding itself. So
Right,
it's a
right.
little bit intertwined.
Welcome to 20-Minute Leaders. Just sit back, relax, and learn from the leaders of today. It's a journey. Each one is different, unique, inspiring. Let's get started. This episode is powered by J Ventures, a community-driven VC fund in Silicon Valley in partnership with Leumitech, sponsored by Homeward Ventures, Hippo Insurance, Upwest Labs, Synergy Global, Hillel at Stanford, Leap, Birthright Excel, Serona Partners, and in media partnership with CTech. Welcome to 20-Minute Leaders and welcome Orly Glick. Orly joined Vintage in 2016. Before joining Vintage, she worked for McKinsey Co in Belgium, France, and Israel in the fast-growth tech division. Prior to McKinsey, Orly lived for 10 years in California, United States, where she worked for Merrill Lynch in wealth management and private banking. Orly started her career as a mechanics and electronics engineer for Indigo, an Israeli startup in the printing industry that was later acquired by HP. Orly has also managed and advised technology startups. Okay, Orly Glick, welcome to 20-Minute Leaders. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing really, really great. Thank you very, very much. I'm really excited to have you here. This is actually the first episode in almost 700 episodes that I'm going to be talking to somebody in the fund of funds. And I want to know exactly what that means. You're with Vintage Investment Partners, soon embarking on a new and exciting journey. And we'll touch on that transition a little bit. But I'd love to hear your story from the military to McKinsey to Vintage, and looking at fast-growing companies and investing in other funds in the ecosystem. So a lot to unpack in these 20 minutes. And so why don't we just get started? Orly, tell me a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your journey.
Wow. So I'm born and raised in Israel. Did my army services, everybody has to go through here, in technology. Left the army service and started working for basically being like the cable guy here, walking around the neighborhood and fixing cables.
Literally fixing cables?
Yeah, fixing. Oh, that's my series. Sorry. Yeah, fixing. Really, literally fixing, going on people's roofs and fixing cable TV.
Wow.
And then joined Indigo, digital printing, as their service engineer, and then relocated with them to the Netherlands. The headquarters was at Maastricht, wonderful city right on the border of Belgium and Germany. So basically went all around Europe, fixed the machines, drove everywhere in Europe. It was fantastic for a really young age. Fixed those machines all over Europe and in England as well, and in Australia as well a little bit. Then ended up being in the training center and training engineers that came over. So did a lot of technology, mechanics and electronics and stuff like that. Then
were you surrounded by a lot of other female mechanics and a lot of other female engineers that were sort of cable girls?
Story of my life. No, usually the only woman in the room. Yes.
Wow. And what was that experience like already from a young age? I mean, obviously today everybody's talking about the fact that we want to empower more female leaders in the tech world, but I imagine that back then it wasn't necessarily the talk of the street, and it was so common, right?
Yes. So I'm a little old. So it was back then. It was like very very rare. It was. I think that at that age, I was so audacious and with such young chutzpah that I felt like it was, it was okay. It was normal. And I was wondering, it's really weird that there are no other women in the room, like with me on this journey. As I got older, I understood it was a little rare. But I didn't see it as different at that time. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so what was the transition for you from being an engineer to the investment side of things, and McKinsey was in between, right? So what was sort of that path for you?
So it's funny, but indeed, when I was an engineer, I always had grease in my fingernails, and I was sitting one day and thinking, hey, you know what? I've never actually had a business training, and I want to get rid of all this grease in my fingernails. Let's get a real degree, a white collar degree. And so after leaving Indigo, I studied at Maastricht University, did my bachelor's degree there, my master's, and my MBA. And then did my dissertation for McKinsey Company in the area of biotechnology startup evaluation.
Biotechnology
So
startup evaluation. Wow.
yeah, that was
Sounds easy.
many years ago. Yeah, yeah. Well, it was when like the biotechnology ecosystem started emerging from Israel, and so that was really interesting. And then I worked with McKinsey for a few years. Then I had my own company for a few years. Yeah, then moved to the US and did some other stuff there.
So before we advance to what you were doing, some other stuff, and then eventually leading to Vintage, writing a report like this and doing a dissertation on a new emerging technology or emerging really ecosystem and domain within Israel, one that is going to become extremely prominent, not just from the recent announcements we've seen of recent biotech companies, but really in the last decade or so. What is that sort of process for you? How do you go about familiarizing yourself with this domain and coming up with a strong, thesis on what is happening here and how do we foresee what's going to happen?
And your question is when I was back then doing the dissertation or today?
Correct. Yeah. Back then, and
Back
then
then.
I'm gonna ask you about today. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's the thesis was around the emergence of an ecosystem. So, and it's interesting if you look now, you can't imagine the Israeli ecosystem without automotive, right, tech, or without cyber tech. But I mean, people forget that it's an evolution, and it takes years for an ecosystem to be built. And so back then, at the time, it was. Probably the emergence of the biotech ecosystem, and so that was the first things that we did was really to understand what are the common denominators of companies that were successful, and how do you value them.
Hmm. Okay, that makes sense. And so, transition to Vintage. I want to make sure we have enough time to talk about that.
Transition to Vintage. What today? So I mean today, so Vintage manages $3 billion today, and basically investing in two things: in funds and in late stage startups. So the funds is investing in Israeli funds, in European funds, and in US based funds.
Hmm.
Large funds or breakout funds, what we call, which is funds that were started, it's first time funds by experienced managers. And then late stage startups, I would say startups that are around their round B or a little bit later. It's always co-investing with our funds, always coming together with the funds that we're invested in, and it could be a direct investment, and it could be also a secondary. So
Right.
that's something that emerged in the past few years, not on the primary basis, but on a secondary basis when management teams want a little bit of liquidity.
Right. Now, from your perspective, having spent so much time as an engineer yourself, as a technologist, as a researcher, as a consultant, was this, sort of the ideal path or the most, common understanding, if people around you, would they expect Orly to then go into either investing or specifically into a firm like Vintage?
I think that there's no right way. It's investing has many different disciplines in it. You can either come from expertise in a certain domain, and then you are approaching it as an expert in that domain. You can come from a financial background and bringing your financial experience and knowledge. It's basically investment. Being an investor is not for a particular profile, so it's pretty flexible. So actually, when I have a lot of women approaching me and asking, how does to be an investor? How can I be a part of it? I'm never going to be an investor. There's no one answer for it. It's, I think everybody could bring their own skills and experience to becoming an investor.
Hmm. And your personal transition inside, what was that like? So you're moving, farther and farther from the, in Hebrew we say from the metal, from the barzelim. So literally you moved from the cable towards, the Series B and fund stage, on a very personal level. What is your experience like as you're now about to deploy capital and lots of capital into this ecosystem and making those big decisions?
I think that if I'm thinking about my own experience and what am I bringing to the table as an investor, is basically bringing that complicated set of experiences, and having been there and having been interacting with tens of thousands of people in different instances, from technology to different business transactions to different industries. What I brought to the table here is understanding of the business side of experience, understanding the incentives of people, understanding the markets, understanding trends. But again, this is my personal set of experience that I think that I brought to the table here.
Right. And so as you're going around and, let's first start talking about, investing in funds. And then I'd like to understand a little bit about your perspective on late stage companies. I'm also in the investing world, and I see what it's like investing in early stage companies. But when you're thinking about investing in a fund, what does that actually mean? What is a fund of funds on a very basic level?
Sure. So if you think about a fund, on a 30,000 feet level,
Yeah.
or a helicopter view, as we used to call it at McKinsey, it's the sum of
Wait.
all
What's the difference between a helicopter view and a 30,000 feet view?
We have two helicopter pilots in the company. You should ask them. but it's a fund is basically the sum or the aggregation of all its startups, right?
Right.
So if you're thinking about a fund, basically look at the startups that they invested in, or the portfolio companies, and then you can find what the fund is basically all about. And this is really generalizing, right? It's much more than that, and it's about the many things, like the team and the investment team and the supporting team and the added services that they bring into the table, and their thesis, and so on and so on. So there's many things that go into it, but basically, on a general level, it's the portfolio companies at the end of the day and the returns.
And so as you're talking to a fund, how much of that is the is the existing portfolio companies? Because obviously once you're investing, they're going to continue to invest in more portfolio companies. So how much of it is the portfolio companies versus the management and sort of the synergy between you and the managers, or their expertise? How does the distribution look like?
I think it's eventually intertwined, because eventually, it's very strong. The distribution here is not a bell curve distribution. It's a totally different distribution in the VC world,
Okay.
and it's interesting because the good funds attract the good startups, and then the good startups refer other good startups, and eventually they go to the same fund. And it's like it's feeding itself. So
Right.
it's a
Right.
little bit intertwined.
Right. And that makes a lot of sense. And is that process, sort of the due diligence process on a fund, is that in any way similar to due diligence on a startup? Are you looking at similar metrics? Are you asking similar questions? Because a fund is a startup in some sense, but it's also very far from a startup.
It's very interesting because, people think that a fund is completely different species than a startup. But indeed,
Right.
A fund has to fundraise, just like startups have to fundraise.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of challenges that are similar, but it's basically a business. And so, yeah, absolutely agree. It's there's a lot of similarities in this respect. Is
Now you do have to, understand both, because you're doing both. You're both investing in funds, but then you're also co-investing sometimes in the late stage companies. And what does that process look like from you? You're now transitioning your thought process. You're going to meet a late stage company. What is your process like? Because you have a lot of opportunities to invest in late stage, and obviously you don't take all of them. You take only a handful. So what are sort of the defining factors for you in those regards?
So we're always investing alongside our funds. So it's always going to be either that a fund refers startups to us and then we
Right.
invest together, or that we refer startups to our funds in our network. So it'll always be together. And then there's, a due diligence, just a normal due diligence process that takes place, understanding the business, understanding the technology, meeting the team, understanding the landscape, competitive landscape and so on. But it's always going to be together with the funds in our network.
Right. And so if you look back at these 5.5 years of investments, and you even go as far back and think about, from, mechanics and technology to McKinsey, how do you summarize sort of where you're at right now in your career? You're about to embark on something new. So if you stop for a second and reflect on where you are today, what is going through your mind?
Wow, it's a big question.
Yeah.
I think that personally, I've never, there's people that are experts on one thing and they're 20 years in the same thing or 30 years in the same thing. And then they're top experts in their domain for something very specific. I'm a business expert. I've done so many different things from technology to business, from corporates to startups and vice versa. And so I think I look at myself as a business expert. I know what drives people. I know what drives markets. I can see things a little early, and I really love growing things and pushing things and putting KPIs and achieving them. So I think from my perspective, doing business and running a business is what's most exciting for me.
And so when you're saying the running business and pushing the boundaries, is that from a day-to-day management perspective, or is that on a high-level entrepreneurial perspective on the impact that you're going to make on users? Which part really excites you about this?
Wow, all of the above. It's really running the operations and running the teams, but also creating business impact. But also at this point in my life, I'd like to create like a little bit of a global impact, and that's what I'm going to do in the next endeavor. It's going to be something that will create a global impact.
Well, I think that when we talk about impact, you've already made quite a big impact. Almost every day I hear about vintage, and so I think that already there, a big impact has already been obviously made on many portfolio companies that you've invested in and that your funds have invested in. And I want to take you back a little while back, even before the army. And I want to get to know you a little bit better, and perhaps even all the way to elementary school and middle school. If you had to think, what made Orly curious back then? What fascinated you on a day-to-day basis? What are some things that come to mind?
I was always dismantling everything and everywhere, like everything
Probably
electronic.
literally, physically.
Yes.
Yeah.
Dismantling everything electronic, like everything around me that was electronic, I would open it apart and just put it together. So I was really curious about electronic stuff. Also, I had a computer, like the really first computer, like the Commodore or whatever it was called. And there was no internet back at the time. I mean, but I really was fascinated by technology. And at the time, again, there were no women around me or no girls basically around me that talked about technology, and there was no internet. So I couldn't really go online and start, like my son, everything, he's programming, he's doing AI programming, and everything he learned is from online. But so it was, that was something that fascinated me always: technology, electronics, computers, programming.
How far back do you think at what age do you think you already had the conviction that this is going to be your world? That you're going to go into technology, you're going to go into electronics, and that you love it?
I think always. When I was 15 or 14, my mom said, well, you need a profession, and so you have to study electricity so you can do stuff like soldering, stuff like that. So she sent me
Wow.
to a school called Ort. And I was the only girl in the classroom, and I studied, and I wanted computer science, right? But then I came 1 year too late, and so they tricked me, and they said, there is a computer science with electronics. So, the computer science, you already missed that. That's for when you were 15. So I said, okay, electronics, computers, it's the same. That's fine. And then apparently they tricked me. It was 90% electronics and 10% computers. But it's actually, I'm happy that I did it.
If you look at the 5.5 years that just passed with Vintage, obviously there's a lot of inspiration to be gained from working with a lot of the portfolio companies and the impact that Vintage makes, on this ecosystem. But what led to your inspiration on a daily level? So, you wake up every day, you go to work really hard, Where is that source of inspiration coming from?
I think it's the impact. When I see a business, really, when I see a business impact, I get really excited. So when we started the value-added services, for example, we were trying to find kind of, where is it the good win-win for everybody? And when we found it, we saw what works for everybody. And we started putting KPIs, and we put KPIs as the POs and POCs that we generate for companies. Every time we had a PO and POC successful, we celebrated it. So
Incredible.
I think that when there is a business impact and we can make a change, that gets me really excited and inspires me.
I love it. Orly, thank you very, very much for spending this time with me. I really appreciate it. And I loved hearing about your journey, all the way from being the cable girl to McKinsey, to your own company, and to now vintage, and now going back to entrepreneurship. I think that's just awesome. And I can't wait to hear about what you do. And thank you very, very much for the time and inspiration. And stay safe and stay healthy.
Thank you. You too. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.